Alexander Reed's office was a towering castle made of steel and glass over the skyline of Manhattan. Every morning, exactly at 7 a.m., he strolled via the shiny double doors of the international company Reed Industries. He has established a conglomerate from the ground up, his workers wearing sharp objects. He was welcomed with suits and polished smiles, with deference, or was it dread, at 42. One individual named Alexander was in charge of the globe with icy efficiency. His triumph reported in Forbes and discussed in boardrooms everywhere. Now weren't he sat behind his desk, but it was different. Desk, his empire spread out in all directions. His fingertips moved across the surface in front of him. His tablet screen approving, purchasing and firing rivals with a flick force that embodied of his existence. Even if the billion-dollar deals receives the recognition and the lavish lifestyle, and a sense of emptiness he hid it at the limits of his consciousness. Deep into the control layers, rejecting it as a sign of weakness, his aide Evelyn Chen gently rapped on the window pane. Door, her tone was always measured, and the expert shattered his reverie. "Sir, your package arrived," she remarked. There was a little cardboard box on his desk. Lacks a return address, although Alexander took a quick look at the simple, unassuming box, with his name scrolling a script he hadn't seen in more than a year. His jaw tightened, and there was a flash of something that he couldn't identify crossed his eyes. "Leave it here." He placed his order. Evelyn nodded in an emotionless voice and left her shoes clicking. In time with the marble floor, Alexander's gaze went back to the parcel. Even before he did, he knew who had sent it. Reached into his drawer for the blade too. He paused before cutting through the tape. Uncommonness for him, a name spoken in his ex-wife Clara's, thinking like a ghost. They had separated precisely 1 year prior to the day that their relationship had fallen apart. Amazingly, the details are slathered across town IDs for analysis by the Globe. The golden pair had been them. Clara, the strong CEO, and Alexander, the unrestrained artist. Using water and oil, they had been contacted, but for a time they had succeeded up until the knife's cracks were irreversible. Opened the box after sliding through the tape. With a gentle rustling inside a basic envelope on top of a well-wrapped object, he took the packet in his palms. Steady even if the fragrance made his pulse accelerate. Of jasmine, a subtle but steady scent from Clara's smell on the paper. Memories suddenly came flooding back to him. Ordered himself, and he opened the mail. "It's been a year, Alex. Perhaps you've forgotten, or maybe you've decided to have you not. I'm sure you won't comprehend the reason I'm sending this, but I really hope you will open it, Clara." Her penmanship was as graceful, and he set the letter as easily as she did. Set aside and removed the packaging. As the paper dropped, the object below it away, he let out a gasp before he could stop it. It was a piece of art. Not just any painting, however. Clara's. The two of them were shown standing on the painting. The wind in her on Big Sur's cliffs. The remembrance struck him as he placed his hand in hers. With a tidal wave's power it had during their vacation for their anniversary, he recalled how her touch felt, the way her laughter was completely uninhibited. The painting's sky was a whirl of hues of sunset, including orange, pink and purple. However, were there any additional little fractures that split the canvas almost undetectable, yet they shattering the picture like a web of regretfully? He clamped his knuckles on the frame. A year ago, his eyesight became blurry. Had abandoned this from her, from a chaotic and uncertain existence, but genuine. He had persuaded himself that it was choosing reason above emotion when making decisions, order out of chaos. But gazing at the drawing, a rose-shaped lump in his neck before he could steal, his eyes hurt. A tear trickled down his face for Alexander Reed. For the first time in years, the piercing buzz of his intercom shouted out. Broke as soon as he blinked. The mask of control resuming its position, he wiped his neck and hit the, "So, Mr. Reed, what do you have?" 10 minutes for a quarterly investor call. Cancel it, Evelyn's voice stated. Even he was astonished by the words. He had never cancelled a meeting, much less this one. Size of Sir Evelyn's conf bewilderment was evident. "Just do it," he yelled. Took a big breath and kindly put the gently refinishing the box his. Despite the storm, this box was more than only a work of art. It was a query or difficulty. Have you really forgotten that the recollections had just been confined and collecting dust? He had spent hours building the walls behind them. Turned to the sea after passing the city below. Among the sparkling lights, Alexander hadn't relocated. The office was now dark, save for his computer screen's glare. His fingers clicked to access his email. He typed while hovering above the keyboard. A note to Clara Thufirst at her previous address received the item. Then he paused. What was he doing? Attempting to convey that he missed her, lamented that all of the words were difficult to find. His jaw was clenched as he erased the message. He had discovered that emotions were a liability. Is the difficult route, but the quiet of the city and the workplace closed in on him. Life throbbed outside, yet he sensed the picture was all by itself, resting on his desk like a quiet charge. All of a sudden there was a solitary text message on his phone. The screen flashed with an unknown number. His heart thumped as you opened it. It had to be clear. As he wrote, his fingers trembled. An answer, yeah. It arrived nearly you know what to do right away. What did it mean? His thoughts were racing. Heart pounding, he gazed at the phone. Then, feeling more clear-headed, he having not touched his coat in years, he reached for it. They departed via Alexander's footsteps resounded in the subterranean parking garage. As he got close to his, he slipped into a sleek black Aston Martin. The door closes with a leather seat, faint thump, and the inside was silent. Noticeable the painting's weight and the SMS message pressed up against his, the text on his phone's screen, seemed to glow with a ferocity that you know what to do if you are unable to leave. Did he have the calculating, chilly side of his intellect begged him to ignore it? Concentrate on his routine, his life, and his empire. After the divorce he had constructed, but a lower voice muttered in another section, of an alternative route that he had abandoned behind one that he might yet locate if the engine screamed. And he had the guts to life, and he ventured into New York City. At night, the neon lights throughout the city reflect he couldn't tell where it was off the windshield. He continued, but his hands seemed to drive alone, while listening to the buzz of the tire's contact with the asphalt was mesmerizing. And he soon discovered himself arriving at a well-known street. He killed the engine on Clara's Street and gazed at her brownstone while sitting there. Warm light was leaking through the closed drapes. He used to know every detail from the margins. Inch from where the creaking step was placed, the way her kitchen is always on the porch smelled like paint and cinnamon. Curling around the steering wheel were fingers. Why was the leather groaning under his hands? Was he here because he hadn't noticed, or what did you do when you talked to her a year later? He only has to show there with his phone. Buzzed once again with an unknown SMS number. A shiver went down his spine. Are you there? He glanced at the house. Was she there? He wrote an answer while observing him, using unsteady fingers. Okay, a moment, then for a minute, he caught his breath. Pondered leaving in a car and acting as if none had occurred, but the pain in he walked out of his chest, which would not allow him to the chilly night air in the automobile, was stinging into his skin, and proceeded to her home via the stairs. He gently knocked, and the sound almost vanished. When the door opened that night, there she was, Clara, and she had a distinct appearance, similar to yet distinct from her auburn hair shorter around her jawline. Eyes that were formerly able to see. There was a protective warmth inside him that she wearing pants and a basic pullover, and her feet naked for a while against the wooden floor. They just gazed at one another for a minute. The looming weight of a year's stillness. Hey, between them, she whispered quietly, said in a gruff voice. Come in. She moved out of the way and entered the house where he used to live. He was welcomed with the aroma of paint and jasmine, and his senses were overwhelmed by recollections. Gulped, the living room was just, he recalled, crowded, vivid, and alive. Her painting materials were strewn all over the coffee table. With a partially completed painting, he was leaning against the window on an easel. Observed the little adjustments, a new rug, various toss pillows, yet it felt like her. She gestured for him to have a seat. He sat down on the sofa, and she sat down opposite him. Her hands, you received the parcel, clutched on her lap. She acknowledged, but he paused, asking why now, Clara? She inhaled deeply through her fingertips. I needed you to see me, so I tightened. Her voice was gone, and we lost what you lost. Shuddered a little, but her eyes stayed stable. I believed I could go on, yet I couldn't, till I was certain you comprehended. He glanced down at his hands, and I believed I was acting appropriately. He said, Did you hear her voice gently for the two of us? Has been sharpened by a year of quiet, Or was it just more convenient for you to rush to take charge of everyone and everything? Apart from your own feelings, her comments cut deep because it was true that he had fled when things became convoluted and messy indeed. He had opted for the security of his empire over love's unpredictability. I'm not sure how to resolve this issue. He had his tongue, found the words bitter, or if it even Clara's eyes maybe softened, the rage turning into something else. I'm not asking you to repair it since it's delicate. I want you to experience it, Alex, so you can let you experience something other than power. With authority, he gazed at the lady. He had experienced both love and loss, and for the first moment, the barriers around his heart started to break the void he had been holding. Wasn't emptiness, rather, it was regret, anguish, and a desiring what he had also buried. Why did you email me the artwork, Deep? His voice was no more than a whisper as he inquired. She gave a sorrowful grin. Since that day in Big. When was the last time I really saw you, sir? Glad. I wanted you to have in mind what it felt fragile to be alive, to love unconditionally. He shut his eyes, the wind's recollection on that cliff's chuckle, and the sensation of her hand in his smashing like a wave over him upon opening them once again. His eyesight was, I apologize, he murmured to Clara, extended her hand and touched his hand. I am aware that they sat quietly, the years of pain and miscommunication for the first time, circling them for a while. Alexander didn't experience he needs to restrain his emotions. Eventually, she rose and fell like the sea. I'm not sure whether we can go back, but I talked. Perhaps he glanced at her hope. Flashing in his heart's shadows of domesticity that temporarily confused him, he was sitting on the sofa when a light he sat up with a blanket over his head. Stiff joint after a sleepless night, slumber the recollections of the past as nightfall gradually arrived, the raw talking with Clara, the fragile hopeful that they may be able to locate returning to one another. But now, in the sharp clarity of uncertainty, in the sunshine creeped in, had he arrived in error, by exposing old wounds that might the faint clinking sound will never go away. He was drawn to the kitchen by dishes. Clara stood with her back to him at the counter. She was holding a cup with steam coming from it. As he walked in, her eyes capturing there was no animosity present, and she said that it was simply a tentative peace dawn. Gently, he stroked the back of his neck in the morning. Didn't intend to remain, but it's okay, she grinned. You seemed a bit in need of the... He nodded, uncertain of how to react. They were silent as they stood in the space between, though still enormous, they are not insurmountable. Saw the mail piled up on the counter. While some opened the envelopes, others threw away a postcard emerged from the stack. Vibrant hues that are consistent with in the quiet tones of the kitchen. He heard a peak of the Golden Gate Bridge that you're seeing, attempting to get to San Francisco. He inquired. She struggled to maintain a neutral tone in his voice. Yes, there is a residence for artists there. The gallery would want to display some of my pieces. I've been considering it for some time. Naturally, he had a pang in his chest. She was on her way, so why wouldn't she? Was no longer bound by his inflexibility and unwillingness to bend. When will you go next? The words lingered in the atmosphere like he felt his window of death nail, chance to seal the delicate likelihood of reconciliation. Failing, he gritted his teeth through his fingers. Battling the panic that was rising within him, Alex stated in a soft voice, I didn't. I know you told me to harm you, he answered. Despite seeming like a lie, he was unaware of it. What he anticipated when he arrived here, clean slate forgiveness, is given another opportunity. To him, on a platter, he ought to know better. Would you want some? She offered coffee, shifting the conversation. She turned to pour him a drink when he nodded. Cup, and everything briefly felt. He saw her move the nearly typical elegant manner in which she moved around the little he used to be familiar with every aspect of the kitchen. Her habits, every detail of her expressions, he felt alienated now. Looking out a window when she touched his cup with her fingertips. Contact was short, but he looked electrifying. Rising, confronting her gaze with an unsaid, shared a desire amongst them. Clara, combined with dread, he said in a tense voice, I don't want to lose you once again, but her gaze became softer. I'm not sure whether there was any sorrow there. Alex, I'm not sure if we can repair this. He gulped hard. The thing that we were meant to his tongue was reprimanded by the harsh coffee. wanted to quarrel in order to inform her that they may change what love was in the past. Sufficient, but he was aware that love hadn't been sufficient before a frontal knock. As soon as Clara scowled, the door shattered. "Alexander, please excuse me while I put down her cup." Anxiety as she walked to the door, something knotted in his gut. Off, which he was unable to define, but a feeling he felt a shiver of fear as she opened. A guy stood tall at the entrance. Wearing a black suit and his face, the guy asked his unreadable Ms. Foster. "Yes, Clara, your voice is professional and clipped." With a furrowed brow, she responded, and he gave her, "You've been served," an envelope in her face. Grew pale, and she felt the envelope quiver. Hands as she gazed at it, wondering what it was. The guy replied, "Legal notice, curtly. Need to reply within 20 days before she may inquire more." He turned and left the sound of sneakers clicking menacingly on the sidewalk slowly. Clara used her fingers to shut the door. Her eyes were focused on the envelope, were deeply ingrained with dread and bewilderment. Alexander questioned, "What are her features?" Coming forward, "Even if I don't know her," the voice trembled. It was Reed Industries. His blood became icy. She tore open the package and revealed, fumbling with the paper in her hands, scanned the paper after unfolding it. Tears welling up in her eyes. "It's a lawsuit," she said. "Your business is accusing me of contract violations. They allege a copyright violation. If my artwork transgresses your..." He believed that intellectual property was the earth had vanished under his feet. "I didn't approve, thus that's not feasible." Who then caused her voice to crack? Vale's rage and betrayal are brewing to the surface. She pushed the paper toward him. "Alex, he took your signature right here." The page, his eyesight becoming blurry as he gazed at his own name scroll at it, was his at the bottom of the page. Signature, or at the very least a flawless fake. His thoughts were racing. He hadn't signed this. Was aware that he hadn't butted someone in his. There was an authority figure in the firm. "I didn't do this to represent him," he replied to Clara. Desperately, "You must, I can assure you," that her voice was icy. Now, the morning's warmth had broken. "Isn't this just what you do? Dominance, control, and destruction of whatever that doesn't belong in your ideal world." He panic rising. "I swear," he shook his head. "This isn't me. I'm incapable of doing it." Alex interrupted her gaze once again. "I'm sobbing and unable to return to, because life is always unsure of when the next." She turned aside, knowing that a strike would come. Shoulders shaking, he extended his hand, but it was unsuccessful. The gap between them is insurmountable. Chasm, the life's walls were closing. He had made a valiant attempt to recover, sliding like sand between his fingertips. He needed to figure out how to remedy this. Who was responsible for this treachery? Although initially, "I'm going to create this," because he had to depart. "True," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm not sure how," but she didn't reply. He turned around and left the door, the sun glaring at him as he entered the street where the universe, everything was the same outside. Yet he had changed inside and arrived here. In the hopes of redemption, he had discovered a plot, and it was just opening the door to the Reading Industries, opened with a compressed air hiss. However, it felt like stepping to Alexander, into a battlefield, the sterile, shining normally a source of pride. The lobby now feels icy, like a machine's heart snarling him. He strode across the marble floor. His footfall were piercing, and every step driven by anger, and Mr. Reed, Evelyn Chen, contacted in desperation. Her eyes were wild as she left the reception counter. "The board is now not there," with alert, snapped, hardly able to hear her. Blood rushing into his ears, he stayed away from the elevators and used the steps to his office, 2 at a time. Who did this? Someone had a mind-blowing, used his business as a weapon against the wife. They were going to reimburse him for what he liked. Rushed through the glass walls of his office. Somewhat trembling due to the power of the skyline behind him, slammed the door. The metropolis loomed beyond the windows, extending like an empire under him. He lost control and fell into his chair and turned on his computer. Fingers darted across the keyboard, tugging up documents, emails, and authorizations. Whatever would provide him with a thread to follow. He was aware of each contract that passed over his desk, each and every signature. But someone had managed to slide. The lawsuit was a betrayal of him. Was true, yet it was wrong, against Clara. He squinted as he looked at the document's digital signature. He looked at the time and date stamp. It was approved 2 days before, when he had attended a conference with the European. He hadn't even visited the investors, tightening his jaw. Someone had Evelyn, he growled after forging his signature. She hurried in with a tablet in her hand. Yes, Mr. Reed, I must know who had my digital signature is accessible in the... He said last week that every logon. Immediately, Evelyn's fingers began to shake. A little as she retrieved the information she was devoted, maybe the only one remaining, who really was in this building, and he could tell that she was afraid, yet she had enough faith in him to comply with his request. When the news hit her, her face went white. Richard Sterling appeared on film. Richard. Alexander's stomach sank. Sterling. A guy who serves as his main legal officer, who had worked with the business since inception. He had first trusted a guy in. Unconsciously, he grabbed the iPad from Evelyn, is looking at the evidence in her hands. Richard had gotten into his electronic signature, use it to approve the "where is he" in the case against Clara. There was a hoarse snarl in Alexander's voice, and the Evelyn said, "They're waiting in the boardroom. There is discussion of taking you out," as the CEO felt the term physically. He sacrificed this empire in order to build it. Everything, even his union with, turn it into what it was. And they were his palms tightened as he turned on his fists. But if I arrive first, suddenly, the boardroom doors sprang open. Shocking the executives, 12 in attendance, several sets of eyes looked at Alexander. Overwhelmed with remorse, while some a chilly computation at the table's head, sat Richard Sterling, tidied up his silver hair. Sharply combed his eyes behind rimless glasses, the corporate poise image smoothly. "Alexander," Richard observed, "we weren't anticipating you, but you undoubtedly were." Alexander took a bite out of his skull. Of the table, staring at Richard. "Tell me why my business is suing." The look on Clara Foster Richard's face didn't flicker. "Her artwork is a legal concern. Violates our intellectual property rights." Alexander, "Our property," paused his like a whip. "And the artwork is one of my memories that has nothing to do with Richard. What are you doing with this company?" Constricted a vein that pulsed in his temple. "There is no room for your personal life. Alexander, Yuri's distractions at the workplace have been jeopardizing our business. The board decides that a change is needed." Alexander glanced around the table, taking in some of the board members ignored the people they met. Steely resolve, betrayal in his eyes had permeated the foundation of, "This isn't about Clara, his empire. This is dangerous," he warned in a quiet voice. Richard's lips formed a thin line in a coup. Smiling, or whatever you choose to name it, Reed leadership in the Indres must be centered on Alexander's profit, not sentimentality. His fists were clenched. But he made himself breathe to believe that Richard desired for him to lose self-control, to snap, and demonstrate the board right, rather than Alexander. His arm was straightened, but he edged it with, "You think you can handle this steel? He said that you fabricated my company. Signature, you played about with the system, and you took advantage of the lady I love." As a Richard's self-assurance wavered, "For I'll use this short opportunity to court. If I must continue, Alexander, I'll give you a public scandal if you want one. Let's examine one fraud plot to observe how regarding that, stockholders have a whisper of uncertainty," shook the room. The facade thinned as Richard's eyes. "Alexander, you have no evidence that you're cracking. Shown the tablet. I have all the evidence. I need access records, logs and timestamps." "Richard, you're done. Shut down the board." Members looked at one another uneasily. Richard's face was twisted by the tide. "Alexander, you're making a mistake." In fury, said, "I'm at last making the right decision." He looked at the board that I had constructed. "Business I've erred, but I won't allow corruption to ruin what I've working for. Provided you support Richard, you'll follow him down, one by one." Board members turned their heads away from Richard. Richard, the power dynamic changed. Quickly got up from his chair, scratching the floor. "This isn't finished yet." Coldly, Alexander said, "Security will 2 guards arrive to take you away." At Richard's face behind the door was a mask of fury as they escorted him out. The door shut behind him with a decisiveness that reverberated across the space. Alexander took taking a long breath. The storm was over, yet he took out his phone before finishing his assignment. "I called Clara, who picked up the phone the second ring." Her voice, and "Be cautious. Alex, it's over." Said that I arranged the lawsuit. The betrayal. A silence occurred, and he said, "What about us? It's up to you whether you swallowed hard, but I want to attempt, and I want to do it correctly this time." There was a long period of stillness, and then she murmured to me, and a wave of relief passed over him. The future, for the first time in years, felt unsure, and he was glad of it.